Hello and welcome back to CST 2120. In this session I'm going to explain how you can manage sessions using Express. So when we load different pages on a website, we often need to track the user as they move between those different pages. So for example, if you go to your Insta page or whatever, first you've got to log in, and somehow you need a connection between the action of logging in and the action of viewing the page, otherwise anyone could view your page and modify your details. And we can't just do that with simple JavaScript, because each time we refresh the page or load a new page, the JavaScript variables get reset. So instead, if you remember, in the first coursework, we managed sessions using HTML session storage. The session storage is a kind of storage that persists across pages, but not across tabs or across windows, and it times out after a certain time. So it's kind of good for this. So what we did in coursework 1, or some of you did, is we still put a variable in session storage to record which particular user has logged in, and that way even if they refresh the page or load another page, we could track that user and we'd know that the user who logged in was the user who was playing the game, and we could update the user's score appropriately in the ranking table. Now for coursework 2, we're using an HTTP server, and HTTP is what's called a stateless protocol. So you send a request, get, post, put, delete, etc. You get back a reply from the server, and that's it, right? So there's nothing in the actual interaction between the client and server that tells the server that you're the person who logged in 5 minutes ago. Yeah. So what we need is some kind of mechanism to track one users between the HTTP requests. So one HTTP request might post the login details, a second one might request the feed, for example. And so somehow we need to know that the person who logged in is the same person who requested their feed. And that's kind of session tracking, which is basically tracking the user between these HTTP interactions. So we're using a server, an HTTP server. Typically we'd handle session management in the following way. So first we'd have the first post request where the client sends the login details to the server. If the login's successful, username password match, then the server generates a random string of characters known as a session key, and there's certain sort of security issues with this. So obviously it shouldn't be an easy sequence of characters that's easy to guess. So the server generates this random string of characters, and it sends this session key back to the client. And then each time that the client interacts with the server in subsequent HTTP requests, it includes the session key somehow. And then all the server has to do is look up the sessions, use the session key to look up which particular user sent that request, because it can associate that random string of characters with like a username or email or that kind of stuff. Yeah. So this session key is used by the server to track the client across multiple HTTP requests, and the client has to send that to the server each time to make that possible. Now, one easy way to do this is to drop the session key in a cookie on the HTTP client, and then the cookie will automatically be sent from the client to the server each time, and therefore that makes it easy to track. But it doesn't have to be done that way. In theory, you could generate your own session key and send it to the client using like in the body of the message, for example, and then the JavaScript could then put that session key in the body of the message each time it sent it to the server. It would work in exactly the same way. And I'll mention JSON Web Tokens a little bit later, which is kind of a similar idea to kind of managing the whole thing with JavaScript. The disadvantage of managing it yourself is you've got to manage it yourself, you've got to write code for it, whereas as I'll show you, if we just use the built-in Express session module, everything's really easy and we don't have to worry about much at all. Yeah. So I'm going to focus on Express session management in this talk. You're welcome to use a different approach if you want, but if you want the easy life, just use this. And obviously, because Express is massive, people have spent a lot of time thinking about the various security issues that might arise with it, so you can be fairly sure that it's fairly secure. Yeah? So to use Express session management, we use the module Express Session, and it basically just handles everything for you. So when it's enabled, each request includes a session object, and I'll show you how that works, where we can store details about logged in users. So the session object here inside the request is a lot like session storage in the browser, except it's server-side and it's used to track across HTTP requests rather than just across pages using local and session storage. And Express Sessions are managed using cookies, so I'll show you how that works, but basically it drops a cookie on the client machine. The cookie is sent with every HTTP request, and then the server uses that to track who sent that request in between HTTP interactions. Very easy to use, just install it with npm, import the module, small amount of code to configure it, and then we can store and retrieve data to and from this request session object, and I'll show you how that works. So to configure it's really easy. We just import the express session from express session, and then use app.use to basically set this express session inside the express server. And it's got a bunch of stuff, which you don't really need to worry about. Just use standard values for this unless you really want to change them. The only one thing you might concern yourself with is the max age of the cookie. So the cookie will basically time out after 60 seconds in this case, unless it's refreshed. I think unless it's refreshed. If you want to, longer or shorter, you can adjust the time there. Yeah. So once you've configured express session, you can store and retrieve data to or from the session object. So it's really easy. We've got the request.session.username. We can stick a username in there, Tom Smith, put an email in there. And then the next interaction with the server, we can just retrieve this same data if it's been sent from the same client. So for example, request.session.email, just like any ordinary JavaScript object, contains the email that we stored earlier. But obviously if that request is sent from a different HTTP client without the cookie, it'll have null values or be completely empty. Yeah? So just to show you how this works, I'm just going to walk through a couple of pretty simple examples that will show you how to use it. Yeah? First one is the most basic I could think of that just shows the functionality in action, which I'm calling a simple session example. So what happens with this example is the client can send some data to the server, which is stored in request session, and then the data is returned to the client that sent the data. Remember, it's always specific to a particular client, and that's the whole point of this thing. Yeah? So the data is not available to HTTP clients who do not have the session key stored in a cookie. You probably clone the session. I did have a quick go at that, but didn't have much success. But unless you're cloning the values in the cookie, it's just not going to work. Yeah? So standard express routing here. So I've got a post route to my fake student ID. I'm sending some data and I'm extracting that from the body of the message covered in earlier lecture. And then to store it in the session, all I do is request.session.userdata. In this case, you can call it what you like. It could be request.session.cat. It doesn't really matter what you call it. But basically, I'm creating a key inside the session object that's pointing to that data that's being sent to the server. So that stores the data in the session. And to return the data stored in the session key, I've set up a path that send a GET request to this path. I've set it up. And then if the user data has been stored previously, it'll send that data back, and otherwise it'll just send back that there's no user data. So let's do a little demo of that. So here's my simple express session. So to go demo this Thunder client, so let's just run this thing. So initially, if I'm sending a GET request to this path, then I haven't stored any user data in there, so it says user data false. Yeah, and I'm going to show you on two browsers just to sort of make it clear. So here, the browser is going to send a GET request, and it's giving user data false, okay, because there's no data stored. Yeah. But now if I post to there, I can store like the email and the name inside the session object. Yeah. So if I do send there, it says data received true, and it's got the user data, and it's echoing back the user data that received. So now after I've sent the data and stored it, send a GET request to it. And then this time, instead of saying no data is saved, it gives me user data here and gives me the data here. Now if I go to a different browser and refresh it, you can see it's dropped the cookie on it. But because this is a different cookie with a different set of random characters, this browser, because it's a different HTTP client, doesn't get the data, whereas the client that sent the data originally, because it's got the right cookie, is getting the right data back. Yeah. And now if I delete the cookie on the client, which basically invalidates the session, right? So I delete that, and then go back here, where we got. So there's a lag on it for some reason. Anyway, now if I send the GET request, having deleted the cookie, then I get user data false because I basically nullified the session by deleting the cookie. Okay, so that's a very simple example, just to show you it working. Now I'm going to do a sort of nicer example that kind of brings together the different things that you're going to need to do for your web service to make session management work. So here I'm going to show you how to use sessions to track users across multiple HTTP requests, but instead of just having the simple dumping data in the session key, we're going to show you a more realistic example where we're logging into the server, checking the login status, and blocking or enabling access to some of the user's data, in this case kind of fake feed. Yeah. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate this with MongoDB. I'm just going to store data in an array. This is just for demonstration purposes. Don't do this in your real projects or you'll lose an awful lot of marks. Yeah. Okay, so to make this work, I need some kind of registration system. I could have hard-coded it, but I'm just going to have one here. So just posting to users, do a few checks, and stick the user data in the array. So I've got some users to register with. That's the point of that. Yeah. Now we come to the more important part, the login path. So what I'm doing is I'm sending the login data, email, username, that kind of stuff. And then I'm looking inside the user array to see if the email and the password match any of the entries in there. And then this is the new bit of sort of code that I'm covering here. What I'm going to do is store the email of the logged in user inside the request session. Yeah. So it's just like we stored the email as inside the logged in user variable, but in this case it's going in the request session instead. Yeah. Now to check the login status, we can do that using the request session, right? So here we've got get login, which is basically going to return the login status. And it's really easy. All we need to do is see if the request session has the email key set in there. And if it is, we respond with the login true. Otherwise, we respond with login false. It's got a not statement here. So obviously then, if there's no email in the request session, it says login false. If there is, it echoes back the email of the logged in user. To log out, we in this case, send a delete request to that path, the login path. And we could just manually delete the keys, but it's sort of nicer to use the proper sort of tool for this, so to speak. And what we can do is call request.session.destroy, which clears all of the user data in a nice sort of sensible way. So that's what we should use to end the session. And just to show you how we might use this in practice, suppose we've got the user's feed. Now we don't want, random people across the internet looking at my feed or posting to my feed or this kind of thing. So you need to restrict access to resources using this session technology. Yeah? So for example, it's on a get to feed. We want to see if the user has logged in previously, in which case the email would be stored there. And in that case, we'd say if they're not logged in, there's no email in there, we're going to give them a message, you can't see your feed. Reasonable enough, I think. Otherwise, if we've stored the email in a previous HTTP interaction, then we can then return the appropriate feed. In this case, just the demo feed to show you how it works. Okay, this looks like a lot to demonstrate, but it shouldn't take too long. Yeah, so let's just start my sort of more fully fledged run. Yeah. Okay, so let's just create a little more space as well. Okay, so big manager. Okay, I'll get rid of that for the moment. Right, so let's start with registering a user. Yeah, so we're posting the users, we've got email and a password here. Yeah, so registration 2, that's all kind of works, right? So next step is we might want to then check the login status. Yeah. Okay, so login now is false, and if I send a GET request here to kind of log in, you'll see the same thing working in here. So login false. Yeah, so same idea as the previous demonstration for different browsers. Yeah. So now if we're going to try and log in, if we get it wrong, it kind of works, it checks it or whatever, but if we send the right details here, then it gives us login true, and it echoes back the email of the logged in user. Yeah. And now if we send a GET request to login, we're getting login true because we've logged in on this browser, and same as before, right? We've got the cookie being dropped there, and it's using that cookie to track the interactions in the HTTP request. Go back to Chrome here, there's a different cookie here, so even if we refresh the page, it's still going to give us login false because the user here is logged in, not the user on Chrome, and that's exactly what we want. Yeah. And now we can log out, which destroys the session if you remember. So currently we're logged in, if we delete that, it gives us logged in false, and if we send get login, it's still login false. Yeah. Now, we can use this kind of mechanism to protect resources that only the user who's logged in should be able to see, right? So now, if we send a GET request to feed, it's checking to see if there's anything in the session object. If there isn't, it echoes back, you're not authorized to view feeds. But now if we log in to start with, so post login, now we're logged in true. Now we can do a second HTTP interaction to get the feed. And then now we can see login true, and we're getting the demo feed. So this is the crucial point, right? That we're storing the email of the logged in user in the request session, and each time they're trying to access a protected resource, we're checking to see if that email value has been stored. If it has, we give them access. If it hasn't, we don't. And this only gives them access with the cookie that's been dropped on the Thunder client in this case. Any other kind of clients can't access that resource. Yeah. So this is the correct way to do it, and I strongly recommend you implement this correctly, because there's like at least 5 marks for this in the coursework. Okay, so to wrap it up, HTTP is stateless, which means that the server doesn't have any way of telling whether the current interaction is from the same person or client as a previous interaction. So what we have to do is use session management to track users across multiple HTTP requests. And I've shown you how we can do that, that kind of tracking using express session, which drops a cookie on the client and use that cookie to determine which client it's interacting with in a particular HTTP interaction. It's easy to use express session, hasn't taken me long to explain it. So I recommend that you just use it for coursework too. It works, it's pretty secure, easy, and it's easy. Yeah? But in previous years, other people have kind of asked me, oh, can I use JSON Web Tokens or something different? That's fine. Maybe chat to me or one of the laboratory teachers before you go ahead with that. But you know, it's a bit more fiddly, but kind of useful in other circumstances. So if you like JWT, by all means use JWT, but make sure it has the same effect of blocking access to resources unless the user's logged in. That's it.